In a high-stakes Senate hearing broadcast to 38 million viewers across 5 continents, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett locks eyes with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, not to debate, but to detonate. With a single forgotten ruling, Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education, 1986. Crockett exposes a stunning contradiction in the court's recent landmark decision, shaking the legal world to its core. The chamber falls silent as a single accusation shakes the room. Did the court choose to forget justice? As jaws drop and silence spreads like wildfire, one truth becomes impossible to bury. What did Jasmine uncover that forced even the nation's highest justice to question her own legacy? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in the Senate Judiciary Chamber were too sharp, too deliberate, meant not just to illuminate, but to expose. Cameras rolled silently, broadcasting every glance and breath to millions across the country. What was supposed to be another routine oversight hearing now felt like a powder keg. At the long mahogany table, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat not as an observer, but as a spark waiting to ignite. Her navy suit was crisp, her posture calm, but her eyes, focused, unyielding, held something far more dangerous: intent. In front of her lay a slim, heavy binder that seemed to hum with consequence. Most in the room had dismissed her presence as political theater. They had no idea she'd come to confront not just a ruling, but the selective memory of the Supreme Court itself. Across from her, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sat composed, her reputation as an intellectual force undisputed. She was unshaken, unreadable, until her eyes briefly flicked to Jasmine with the faintest trace of caution. She didn't know the details yet, but she could feel it. The hearing had veered off script. Jasmine wasn't carrying noise. She was carrying a forgotten precedent, one that could rupture the foundation of a decision Jackson herself had authored. And the chamber, unknowingly, was already sitting on the fault line. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to make noise. She was here to expose something, and what she was about to bring into the record would shake the room in ways no one expected. She stood up calmly, her tone measured. "Madam Chair, before I begin my remarks, I'd like to submit a document into the record, one that directly challenges the legal foundation of Jefferson Ver's Department of Education." Most people in the room didn't react at first. It sounded routine. But then she held up a plain black binder, marked only with red letters. Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education, 1986. The moment that title was spoken, something shifted in the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was real, like a chill in the air before a storm. Her aide quietly handed the binder to the clerk, who began passing out copies. As it reached the end of the table, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson took hers. At first, she didn't react. Her movements were steady and professional, until her eyes landed on the title. She paused, just for a second. Jasmine saw it. Jackson opened the binder and began reading, her face still calm. But that moment of hesitation said everything. Jackson knew the case, and she also knew she hadn't mentioned it, not once, not in Jefferson. Jasmine leaned forward, speaking directly into the microphone. Her voice was steady and sharp. Moore was a federal ruling from the Fifth Circuit in 1986. It found that when schools in black neighborhoods suffer from years of low funding, poor buildings, and staff shortages, that's not just unfortunate, it's a violation of equal protection under the Constitution. She looked around. But in Jefferson, the court ruled that similar conditions were not enough to trigger federal action. And more? Jasmine held up the binder again. It wasn't even cited, not once. This time, people in the room took notice. Staffers leaned in, reporters looked up. A few senators began flipping through the pages. Jasmine didn't stop. Moore has never been overturned. It's still valid, and it dealt with nearly the exact same situation as Jefferson. Schools in poor, black communities with fewer resources and more obstacles. She let that sink in. This court didn't reject Moore. It just ignored it. Justice Jackson shifted slightly in her chair. It was barely noticeable, but it was the first sign that she was now fully paying attention. Her fingers touched the edge of the binder, holding it firmly now. Jasmine kept going. When I practiced law in the Fifth Circuit, I studied more. I cited more. I saw judges acknowledge more in their rulings. So imagine how shocked I was when I saw Jefferson, the biggest education ruling of the decade, completely leave it out. Her voice got quieter, but more intense. This isn't just about what's legal. It's about what gets erased, about how our system forgets the truth when it doesn't fit the narrative. The room was dead silent now. Not a cough, not a whisper. Everyone was listening because they knew this was no longer politics. This was something deeper. Jasmine continued. In Jefferson, the court called unequal education access unfortunate, but said it didn't rise to constitutional harm. More disagreed. More recognized it as discrimination. It called it by its name. She looked directly at Jackson. And Madam Justice, you helped write a decision that chose to bury that truth. Justice Jackson didn't say anything. Her face stayed still, but Jasmine could see the change. The stillness wasn't about staying calm. It was about thinking, about realizing that something had been missed, and that Jasmine Crockett had just put it back on the record. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done, not even close. She had already shaken the room by digging up a case no one dared mention. But now she was going to say the one thing nobody else would. And she wasn't going to whisper it. She was going to put it into the record, clear, public, and undeniable. She stepped forward slowly, the microphone just inches from her mouth, her voice steady and low. Justice Jackson, she said without anger, but with something far more cutting, conviction. Did the court forget about more, or did it choose to forget? The words landed like a door slamming shut. The room didn't stir. Even the air felt like it had paused. Jasmine didn't look around. She didn't need the crowd's reaction. Her eyes stayed locked on Jackson. Was more left out, she continued, because it said something this court no longer wants to face out loud? Because it forced us to admit that systemic inequality isn't accidental, and that denying children in poor, Black communities a proper education is a constitutional crisis, not a policy inconvenience? She stopped. Let the weight fall. Silence. Real, full silence. No papers turning, no chairs creaking, no phones clicking. I'm not asking that as a headline, Jasmine added, softer now but every bit as firm. I'm asking as someone who stood in a courtroom, trying to explain to a teenage boy why his school didn't have working heat, while the school 2 miles away had digital whiteboards, full meals, and brand new labs. And I had to stand there knowing we had precedent, more, and yet nobody cared enough to use it. She looked down for a moment, then back up, her tone dropping to something even more personal. I'm asking as someone who watched judges look away from that pain because it was easier to say it wasn't the court's job. Justice Jackson didn't speak. She didn't blink, but she did stop moving completely, her hands frozen over the binder, her face composed, unreadable. Still, the silence around her was loud, too loud. Everyone in the room could feel it, that Jasmine had asked a question no one wanted to answer. Not because it was rude, but because it was true. The senators on the dais had leaned slightly forward. Reporters stared at their screens, unsure whether to type or wait. The public gallery, which had been full of soft murmurs minutes earlier, had turned completely still. Even the cameras, rolling non-stop, felt more like witnesses than machines. And in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, alone, steady, with nothing but the truth in front of her, and silence, thick, heavy, undeniable, pressing in from every side. She had done what few dared, not just question a Supreme Court ruling, but call out the silence it was built on. And just when the silence in the chamber had grown unbearably dense, when Jasmine's unanswered question still rang in the air like a fire alarm no one dared touch, she moved again, slowly, precisely. She reached into her binder and slid 5 crisp documents onto the table. Each one was a weapon, printed with 2 columns, Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education, 1986, on the left, and Jefferson v. Department of Education, 2024, on the right. There was no commentary, no spin, just the raw words of the courts themselves. She looked up, calm and cutting, and said, "Let me show you the record this court tried to bury." She tapped the first page, her finger landing on a sentence that still burned with truth nearly 40 years later. Point 1, she began. Moore ruled that the intentional failure to address racial disparities in public school funding constitutes a form of constitutional neglect. That's not vague. That's not metaphor. That is direct recognition that injustice is built, not accidental. Then she tapped the Jefferson column, her voice steady. While unfortunate, disparities in school funding do not rise to the level of constitutional violation, she read aloud. That's not evolution. That's erasure. You could hear the pen start moving now. First one aide, then three. Even some senators were writing. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but her next sentence made the hair stand on people's arms. When a court calls pain unfortunate, but not unlawful, it's telling an entire generation that their suffering is not only expected, but acceptable. She moved to the next page. Point 2, she said, laying it flat, more explicitly stated that the impact of policy, its effect on students' lives, must be weighed equally with its legislative intent. Because in civil rights law, intent without impact means nothing. But in Jefferson, her voice tightened, Jefferson ignores impact entirely. It only asks what the lawmakers meant to do, not what actually happened to children because of what they failed to do. Her eyes scanned the room. That's a dangerous shift. It protects excuses, not lives. Moore saw the real world. Jefferson sees only paperwork. At that, a low murmur moved across the gallery, like the ripple before a crack forms in stone. She turned the third page slowly, deliberately, each motion carrying more pressure. Point 3, she said. Moore held that things like lack of working heat, outdated textbooks, unsafe classrooms, these were not logistical issues. They were civil rights violations. Her eyes darkened. But Jefferson calls them administrative shortcomings, as if broken heaters in black schools are just bad luck, as if 20-year-old science books are a clerical oversight, as if a cracked ceiling above a child's head is just unfortunate, not unconstitutional. She looked up again. Moore saw those conditions as evidence of a system stacked against the voiceless. Jefferson treats them like budget math errors. She didn't need to yell. The quiet, steady anger in her tone did the work. Every person in the chamber now realized they weren't watching a hearing. They were witnessing an indictment. Point 4, Jasmine continued, flipping to the fourth comparison. Moore was honest. It admitted that unequal education was not just a byproduct of poverty. It was the result of deliberate policy choices, choices made over decades, choices upheld by courts. It said so clearly, state action that perpetuates disparity is indistinguishable from state-sponsored discrimination. She paused, but Jefferson calls that same pattern unintended consequences. It excuses the outcome. It absolves the system. It lets the state say, we didn't mean for that to happen, even when it keeps happening. Her voice dropped, but her words hit harder. That's how injustice stays alive. It keeps wearing new clothes. It hides behind language. It asks you to forget what you already know. She looked around. I didn't forget, and I won't pretend it's invisible. She reached the final page. Point 5, she said. Moore understood something critical, that the Constitution must grow with the people it serves, that equal protection is not a relic, it's a living promise. Moore argued that when the world changes, so must our protections. She paused longer here. But Jefferson says the court's hands are tied, that his job is not to respond to new injustices, that if the founders didn't write about it, the court can't defend it. Jasmine leaned slightly forward. But here's what that really means. It means this court thinks the Constitution is too old, too limited, too blind to see a child in a failing school and call that a violation of her rights. There were no whispers now, no movements, no tapping keyboards. The senators, many of whom had tuned out in other hearings, were frozen. Not one face was blank. Even Justice Jackson sat fully still, her fingertips resting against her binder like it was something fragile or explosive. Jasmine Crockett wasn't reading from a script. She wasn't preaching. She was performing surgery on the legacy of two rulings and making the nation watch the incision. She had drawn blood with words, each of the 5 points hitting like precision strikes on the integrity of Jefferson. The chamber had sat in breathless silence, the contrast between past and present rulings burning into the minds of everyone watching. And then from the far side of the hearing room, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leaned slightly forward. Her hands moved almost imperceptibly, palms pressed flat against the wood, as if grounding herself in the table's solidity before she spoke. "Congresswoman," Jackson began, voice calm but unmistakably firm, "Moore versus Louisiana Board of Education is no longer a controlling precedent." Her words were measured with surgical care, as if each syllable had been debated internally before being spoken aloud. No stutter, no hesitation, but something colder lingered beneath the phrasing. Something that wasn't quite dismissal, but wasn't reverence either. It was the tone of a system that had decided what belonged in memory and what didn't. The line was meant to end the inquiry, to reframe the battlefield around legal protocol rather than moral reckoning. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't so much as blink. Instead, she leaned into the microphone, slowly, deliberately, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked dead center on the highest court's youngest and most intellectually respected justice. Her voice dropped a register, low and unwavering, each word chiseled in stone. "Not being controlling," she said, "is not the same as being discarded." The words hit the room like slow thunder, quiet but seismic. "You didn't overrule Moore. You didn't rebuke it. You just didn't cite it," she continued, her voice steady but tightening with weight. "That isn't legal evolution. That's legal omission." She raised one hand, index finger pointed, not accusingly, but surgically, as if she were identifying a pressure point in a failing body. "You didn't erase it from the books. You erased it from the argument." Then came the sentence that broke the air, like shattering glass. "Law," Jasmine said, her voice neither raised nor soft, just final, "is not selective memory." And with that, the room froze, not in metaphor, in reality. A ripple moved through the space, but it wasn't noise. It was absence. No one turned a page. No aide adjusted their glasses. No senator checked their watch. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from etiquette, but from awe, and maybe fear. One journalist near the press gallery dropped their pen. A young staffer clutched their tablet tighter. One of the stenographers looked up, mid-transcription, as if the sentence had stunned even their muscle memory. The words had passed beyond the realm of legal argument. They had become something else entirely. An indictment, a mirror, a line no one could unhear. Justice Jackson's face didn't falter, but her hands, once confidently resting on the table, had drawn slightly back. Her fingers curled together gently, almost unconsciously. Her eyes held their focus, but there was a flicker, barely there, of something deeper. A recognition, perhaps, that she had just been confronted not by a grandstanding politician, but by a woman who knew the law and the silence it often relied on. And in that suspended instant, Jasmine Crockett, one voice, one binder, no robe, had cracked open the performance of neutrality, not by breaking decorum, but by doing something more dangerous. She remembered what the court had chosen to forget and said it out loud. Long after the gavel had fallen and the hallways of the Capitol returned to silence, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sat alone in her office. The hour was well past midnight, but the city outside her window might as well have vanished. The light on her desk, a single amber-shaded lamp, burned like a spotlight in an interrogation room. Only this time, the person being questioned was her. In front of her sat the ruling she'd so cleanly dismissed just hours ago. Moore vs. Louisiana Board of Education, 1986. She hadn't read it in full in over a decade, maybe longer, but now she wasn't just reading it, she was studying it, line by line, sentence by sentence. And with every page turned, the weight in her chest pressed harder. At first it was only faint, a word here, a phrase there, echoes she recognized but couldn't quite place. Then came a paragraph that stopped her breath short. It was as if she were reading her own voice, except it had been written nearly 40 years earlier. Moore didn't just align with her dissents in recent cases, it predicted them. It held arguments she thought she had forged in fire, language she believed was new. But there it was, on yellowing paper, spelled out in painful clarity. The same moral urgency, the same insistence that constitutional silence could be just as dangerous as constitutional error. Her own dissents, meticulously crafted, fiercely defended, now felt like echoes of a truth long ago spoken and left to rot in judicial neglect. She shifted in her chair, uneasy, her fingers tightening along the edge of the binder. Had she contributed to that forgetting? Not intentionally, never intentionally. But omission doesn't require malice. It only requires silence. She turned the next page with more hesitation than before. Another passage. This one so close in language to her Carson verse state dissent that for a split second she wondered if someone had plagiarized her. Then she remembered. More came first. She hadn't been silenced by the institution. She had inherited its silence. A dull ache settled in her chest. She had always believed that the role of the court was to sharpen memory, not blur it. But here was a decision, fully intact, never overturned, quietly shelved, and she had stepped over it. Not once, not twice, but through rulings, through arguments, through polished language she now saw as dangerously hollow when built on forgotten ground. Jasmine Crockett had not exposed a weakness in her jurisprudence. She had exposed a fracture in her conscience. And now in the privacy of her office, no robes, no cameras, no deference, Ketanji Brown Jackson was left to answer the only question that mattered. Had she, in pursuit of justice, helped history disappear? The morning light had begun to seep through the marble slats of the Supreme Court's east windows, but Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson hadn't moved from her chair in hours. Her reading glasses lay discarded on the desk beside the still-open Moore decision, its final page marked by a deep fold where her fingers had gripped it too tightly. The night had offered no rest, only the kind of reflection that doesn't quiet the mind, but stirs it restlessly. She had reread Jasmine Crockett's words not from a transcript, but from memory, over and over. Law is not selective memory. The sentence had drilled into her, not like an accusation, but like a truth she could no longer compartmentalize. Now with the city waking around her, the choice she had avoided all night could no longer be postponed. She picked up the phone. Her thumb hovered over the contact list longer than it should have, not out of pride, out of gravity. This was not a political call. This was a rare kind of call, one that no press release could sanitize, no aid could deflect. She found the direct number from internal judiciary logs, her pulse steady but slow. When she hit call, she didn't expect to be answered immediately. But on the second ring, Jasmine's voice came through, clear, composed, unmistakably awake. Jackson didn't preamble. She didn't hide behind formality. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice lower than usual, "I've read more. Fully, carefully, and I'd like to hear more. From you, not to justify anything, not to build a defense. I'm calling because I need to understand." There was a long silence on the line. Not cold, contemplative. Jasmine was processing, not reacting. It wasn't the silence of shock or suspicion. It was the silence of someone who had waited far too long to be heard and wasn't going to speak lightly just because someone finally decided to listen. Finally, Jasmine answered. Her voice came quiet but full of resolve. "I'll come," she said. "But let me be clear." Jackson's hand tensed around the receiver, waiting. "I'm not coming to win," Jasmine continued. "I'm not interested in the optics. This isn't about who's right on paper." A pause. "I'm coming to revive what justice buried in silence." And there it was. Not a concession, not a challenge. A mission. Jackson didn't reply immediately. She stared at the line of light crossing her desk and simply said, "Where?" Because she understood. This wasn't dialogue. This was reckoning. Not just between two women, but between truth and the architecture that forgot it. The Supreme Court chamber they met in wasn't the grand bench seen on television. This one was quieter. A private consultation room lined with dark oak shelves, the scent of old paper and polished stone lingering in the air like memory. There were no clerks, no aides, no recorders, just two chairs, one worn leather table, and the soft hum of the Capitol's breath outside. Jasmine Crockett entered first, not with fire but with precision, an energy that said she hadn't come to accuse, but to unearth. Jackson joined moments later, robes set aside, eyes sharp but no longer guarded. They did not shake hands. They didn't need to. Some moments don't require ceremony, only truth. They sat, not like opposing forces, but like two surgeons staring at a wound no one wanted to name. On the table between them, Jasmine placed a weathered binder, thin, beige, and unmistakably old. More Vier, Louisiana, Board of Education, she said, pressing it forward like an offering to history. 1986, the only federal case to frame public education as a constitutional right to equal opportunity, and yet, never cited in Jefferson, never mentioned, not even once. She opened it gently, revealing yellowing pages under clear plastic sheaths, and turned them toward Jackson. This wasn't just oversight, Jasmine continued. Her voice was steady, but beneath it pulsed the ache of 1,000 forgotten classrooms. It was abandonment. This case recognized what millions of poor, Black children needed the court to remember, that education isn't charity. It's infrastructure for justice. And when we pretend it's optional, we don't just rewrite law, we erase lives. Justice Jackson stared at the pages, her lips pressed in a tight line. She didn't interrupt. Her fingers hovered just above the text, almost afraid to touch what they should have long ago held. Then softly she broke the silence. I remember writing arguments like these, she said, eyes unmoving from the case in front of her, fighting for recognition, of dignity, of structure, of what the Constitution should protect. There was a pause, a long, unblinking breath in the air. But I forgot someone had written them first. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with something rarer in a room built on ego, humility. It wasn't defeat, it was the beginning of memory returning. And at that table, between a congresswoman and a justice, justice itself sat, no longer silent. The ink of old decisions may fade, but when memory returns with purpose, even silence must give way to acknowledgement. And the law, for once, must listen. It was a crisp morning at the Supreme Court, business as usual, or so everyone believed. Legal analysts expected procedural filings, perhaps a delayed dissent, but nothing revolutionary. Then, without warning, a digital ping echoed across judicial terminals. Supplemental statement filed, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Jefferson Vier's DOE clerks looked up from their screens. Reporters in the press gallery leaned forward in stunned silence. Even the marble walls seemed to pause. A Supreme Court justice adding commentary after a ruling was almost unheard of. Yet there it was, dated, signed, deliberate. Jackson's name atop a document that felt less like clarification and more like confession. The language was measured, precise, but unmistakably personal. In reviewing the court's reasoning in Jefferson, she wrote, I must acknowledge that a pivotal precedent, Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education, 1986, was not considered in our majority analysis. While the omission does not alter the legal outcome reached, it casts a long shadow over the completeness of our historical framework. She did not mask the discomfort. She did not excuse the oversight. She confronted it head-on. And in doing so, she did something even rarer than admit judicial omission. She named her catalyst. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the final paragraph read. Her dedication to the integrity of legal memory and her insistence on elevating Moore as a foundational lens for equal access has prompted a necessary correction. Justice is not merely found in verdicts, but in the honesty of the path we take to reach them. There was no applause in the chamber, no celebration, just the quiet gravity of history being gently, but unmistakably, recalibrated. And with the stroke of a pen, Crockett's lone voice had broken through the marble. Moore now lived in the record, not as a footnote to be buried again, but as a pulse beneath the law's surface, a truth long ignored, now impossible to forget. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's supplemental statement had sent ripples through the marble corridors of power, but what happened next was not just reaction, it was revelation, an awakening that no scholar, no student, no courtroom could ignore. They called it the Crockett Doctrine before the week was over. Not in jest, not in satire, but in reverence. Across campuses, lecture halls, and op-ed columns, a new legal phrase began to rise. First whispered, then declared, and finally published in bold ink. Law professors revised syllabi overnight. Journals opened emergency submissions. The central thesis was simple yet seismic, that memory in jurisprudence is not passive, it is a responsibility. And when the court forgets, it must be reminded. Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply referenced an old case. She had resurrected it with such precision and fire that the legal world was forced to confront its own selective amnesia. Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education, once a near-forgotten ruling buried in the 1980s, had become the center of national dialogue. Why was it ignored? Who benefited? And how many precedents had been lost beneath the weight of institutional convenience? Major universities, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Howard, called emergency panels. Some called them Moore Jefferson Symposia. Others called them the Doctrine Debates. Legal giants who had once dismissed Jasmine as merely political now quoted her lines with academic weight. Law is not selective memory. Students packed auditoriums in numbers not seen since Bush versus Gore. Young legal minds, especially students of color, rose with trembling voices to ask what else had been erased. What else had been shelved in the name of expediency? Legal historians began combing through archives for other Moore-like cases. Buried truths, unexplored arguments, opinions discarded not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. And in the eye of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman, a former public defender, a black woman in a Navy suit who had walked into the Senate chamber with one forgotten case and walked out having reshaped the architecture of legal conscience. Cable news debated whether she had embarrassed the court. Scholars argued she had redeemed it. But the one thing no one could deny, no one could erase now, was that Crockett had done what few in modern legal history had dared to attempt. She had made the law look at itself in the mirror. At George Washington University, a banner hung across the Law Center entrance. The Crockett Doctrine, Legal Memory as a Moral Duty. Inside, a panel unfolded with near-theatrical intensity. A federal appellate judge called Crockett's confrontation the most ethically necessary disruption in modern judicial oversight. Another scholar compared her to Thurgood Marshall, not because she argued in front of the court, but because she reminded it that it too could forget. And it had. In Jefferson versus Department of Education, the omission of Moore wasn't just a clerical gap. It was an ethical wound, now visible to every eye that once refused to see. Across social media, young law students began quoting her words under the #, Crockett Doctrine. TikToks, explainer threads, even short documentaries emerged, unfolding the narrative like a legal thriller. A viral clip showed Jasmine's now iconic line, "Law is not selective memory," synced over images of torn case files and shuttered schools. But what gave it power wasn't the edit, it was the echo. It was the knowledge that for the first time, someone in Congress had forced the court to admit its own blind spots, not with rage or rhetoric, but with surgical precision and historical clarity. Meanwhile, back in Dallas, Jasmine's old law school held a vigil, not of candles, but of readings. Students read aloud from Moore in front of the campus courthouse. One student stood and said, "We weren't taught this case, but now we will be." Because of her, that night a professor quietly placed a framed print of the Moore opinion next to Crockett's congressional photo in the hallway of civil rights law. Beneath it, a bronze plate read, "Resurrected by truth, remembered by courage." Inside Washington, committee leaders who once rolled their eyes at Jasmine's so-called showmanship now invited her for closed-door consultations on judicial review reform. One senior senator reportedly remarked, "I've never seen a room full of judges go that quiet that fast." Her colleagues didn't all praise her. Some resented the spotlight, some feared the precedent, but even the bitter ones knew she had moved the needle, not with volume, with accuracy. The legal system, for all its complexity, had one weak point: its relationship with memory. And Crockett had hit that vein with the precision of a scalpel. Her act wasn't an ambush, it was an excavation. She had unearthed a precedent not to weaponize it, but to remind those who ruled that rulings live beyond the page. They echo, they vanish, they resurface, and they matter. For the first time in her career, Jasmine Crockett was no longer merely a congresswoman with a law degree. She was being spoken of in law reviews as a jurist in waiting, in spirit if not in robe. She hadn't issued a judgment, but she had changed the way judgments were measured. The law was no longer just about what was written. Thanks to her, it was now about what had been forgotten and who had the courage to remember. But no revelation comes without resistance, and as the Crockett Doctrine ignited national conversation, so too did it awaken the deep fault lines of America's legal conscience. Lines that were never silent, only waiting for the right strike. Within hours of Justice Jackson's supplemental statement, the backlash began to crawl out from the corners of every ideological stronghold. On right-wing talk shows and conservative op-ed columns, the message was coordinated. This was a political ambush. They accused Jasmine Crockett of turning the Supreme Court into a stage and using precedent like a grenade. "Who does she think she is?" one prominent senator barked on live television. "Dragging a sitting justice into a culture war with dusty case files?" Another commentator on a national news network didn't even veil the insult. "She's not a constitutional scholar. She's an opportunist with a vendetta." The court, they argued, had been sullied by someone who didn't even wear the robe. The tone wasn't just dismissive, it was indignant, as if Jasmine had broken into a sacred temple and dared to read aloud the parts the priests had sealed shut. But the criticism didn't come only from the expected corners. On the left, some progressive voices, ironically, were even sharper. "Why did it take a congresswoman to do the job of 9 justices?" one civil rights advocate wrote. Another law professor tweeted, "This is the 10th Amendment's nightmare, a legislative branch schooling the judicial on memory and justice." A viral editorial questioned not Jasmine's courage, but the system's decay. If Crockett is the correction, what does that say about the body that needed correcting? These were not attacks on her. They were laments at the architecture of power, how it had failed so thoroughly that only an outsider could point the spotlight inward. But through it all, through the accusations of showboating, the snide remarks about ambition, the murmurs that she was using law to climb ladders, Jasmine said nothing. No press tour, no rebuttal thread, no Sunday morning soundbite. She let the record speak. She let the case speak. She let more speak. In a time when outrage was a commodity and headlines changed by the hour, she offered silence not as surrender, but as posture, one carved from something deeper than ego, discipline. Her silence was not emptiness, it was control. Inside her office, the walls weren't lined with congratulatory bouquets or framed magazine covers. They were lined with notes, footnotes, marginalia, court archives, records of rulings that had been referenced, redacted, or outright forgotten. Her team, working around the clock, cataloged more than 200 federal decisions from the last 50 years that had striking similarity to more. Each one a quiet grave, each one a question buried beneath bureaucracy. Jasmine wasn't hunting for fame. She was mapping out a memory, one the system itself had tried to forget. Still, the questions kept coming. Was she undermining judicial independence? Was she setting a dangerous precedent? Would future lawmakers now challenge rulings based on emotional resonance rather than legal standing? In polished suits and marble-walled press rooms, pundits debated not what Jasmine had uncovered, but whether she had the right to uncover it. And yet not one of them, not one, refuted the facts. Not one challenged the textual comparison between Moore and Jefferson. They didn't argue with her logic. They attacked the audacity of its source. A woman, a black woman, a congresswoman, not a judge, not a justice, not part of their club. And Jasmine? She remained still. While cameras searched for her reaction, she walked calmly through Capitol hallways, binder in hand, the same way she had entered the Senate Judiciary hearing days before. She had no need for shouting. Her questions had already been asked, and not a single answer had managed to erase their weight. Her silence was not weakness, it was aftermath. It was the storm walking back into itself. In a leaked private conversation, a senior justice reportedly said, "I've never seen the bench rattled like that by someone outside the judiciary." Another aide whispered that Jackson herself had grown quieter in chambers, not because she regretted the ruling, but because she had remembered something painful, that even the well-meaning forget. But Jasmine never gloated. There were no victory laps, just more files, more names, more dates that no one else was reading. In one particularly tense moment, a reporter shouted at her during a hallway gaggle, "Congresswoman Crockett, do you consider your actions a challenge to the court's integrity?" She paused briefly and responded only with this, "Integrity isn't what you protect by silence. It's what you prove by remembering what matters." Then she walked on. Meanwhile, across the country, law students and professors began to feel something they hadn't felt in years. Accountability breathing down the marble columns of judicial reverence. If a single congressional voice could reignite a legal doctrine, what else had been missed? Who else had been dismissed? The system had always assumed no one would notice. But Jasmine noticed, and she didn't just notice, she remembered, out loud, on record. In the end, the noise around her swelled like weather, but none of it moved her, because she hadn't come to please a party, or shame a court, or win applause. She had come to ask why a case that promised equal education to children who looked like her had been ignored for 38 years. And when she didn't get an answer, she made the silence loud enough that it couldn't be ignored again. And that was the difference. While others flinched from discomfort or hid behind protocols, she stood still in the eye of it all, unmoved, unafraid, letting the facts weigh more than her voice. Because sometimes power isn't in speaking. It's in knowing when to make the truth speak for itself. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett had said more than 1,000 rulings ever could. But in the quiet corridors of influence, where power doesn't shout but whispers, something unexpected stirred, not from a protester, a pundit, or a professor, but from the last person anyone imagined would respond. The envelope was thick and hand-addressed, a relic in an age of instant communication. No staffer brought it in. It was slipped beneath her office door sometime after midnight. No return address, no seal, just her name in sharp, deliberate strokes. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The moment she saw the handwriting, she knew. It carried the weight of someone who'd written millions of words that had reshaped lives but rarely revisited them. Jasmine opened it with steady hands, but inside her pulse shifted. It was a letter from Associate Justice Clarence Thomas, typed but signed in ink, precise, reserved. And yet beneath every sentence, something unspoken pulsed. Grudging respect, veiled confrontation, and a peculiar vulnerability he hadn't shown in decades. The letter was short, no legal jargon, no citations, no flattery. Just one line stood out like a blade in velvet. "I do not agree with you, but you forced me to reread what I chose to forget." That is rare. For a man who had spent much of his tenure dismissing the judicial legacy of civil rights as overreach, this was not an olive branch. It was a tremor in marble. Clarence Thomas, the man whose opinions often reflected a worldview Jasmine had spent her life confronting, had cracked his silence. Not to concede, but to acknowledge that he had in fact looked back. And it wasn't just that he had reread Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education. It was the way he said "forced me," as if truth, uninvited, had sat itself down beside him and waited until he turned the page. Jasmine folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. No staff saw her reaction. No cameras caught her smile. It wasn't triumph. It was confirmation. The kind of response you don't expect from power, especially power that has rarely been made to look back. She whispered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone. Not agreement, just attention. That's all truth ever needed. She didn't call him, didn't write back, didn't tweet it out. She let it sit where it belonged, between two people on opposite ends of a gavel who had, for one moment, shared the same line in the same forgotten case. Outside her office, reporters were still spinning circles around the Crockett Doctrine. Headlines debated whether it would reshape future judicial reviews or quietly fade like so many noble efforts before it. But inside those marble walls on First Street Northeast, something else was happening, something no editorial could quantify. The doctrine was being read, because in his chambers, Clarence Thomas hadn't just skimmed the Moore opinion, he had annotated it, quietly, reluctantly, but line by line. In the margins, aides later noticed, he had written short questions to himself. Why was this buried? Was this too idealistic or too dangerous? And beneath a paragraph outlining the rights of marginalized students, one sentence in his own hand. I opposed this thinking then, but I never answered it. That night, Jasmine walked home alone, coat wrapped tight, city lights bleeding into the wet pavement. The Capitol dome loomed behind her, silent, glowing, indifferent. But she wasn't chasing change anymore. It had turned to face her. She didn't need to see Clarence Thomas nod from a bench. She only needed to know that for once, the system that prided itself on finality was now uncertain. And in a legal universe built on precedent, uncertainty is not weakness, it is potential. The next morning, someone asked her in a hallway gaggle, Congresswoman, are you surprised Justice Thomas wrote to you? Jasmine paused, eyes level, voice steady. No, she said, not surprised, just reminded that memory is a dangerous thing when it starts asking questions. Then she turned and walked away. Letter still tucked in her coat pocket like a loaded truth with no safety cap. Behind closed doors, the whispers grew. Some clerks inside the Supreme Court saw their mentors printing more. One senior fellow at a legal institute said it felt like watching tectonic plates shift under institutional furniture. The Moore opinion, once a footnote relegated to the dusty corners of academia, was now a ghost rattling the bones of rulings past. And it wasn't Jasmine who gave it that power. She had simply dug where no one else dared. The law had written the words. She had merely read them aloud. In the weeks that followed, a few other justices remained silent, but one reportedly told a confidant. Clarence writing that letter was louder than a dissent, and in the hush of that statement lived a truth none of them said aloud. Jasmine had made the bench uncomfortable, not by defying it, but by holding it accountable to its own history. Later that week, a young law student at Howard University held up a copy of Moore during a symposium and said, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. If Moore was forgotten, what else have they buried? The auditorium erupted, not in chaos but in clarity, the kind that comes when someone lights a torch in a long-abandoned corridor and others finally see the walls. And the writing. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to her work. No celebration, no campaign fundraiser tied to her name, no victory parade, just more folders, more cases, more unclosed stories. Her job wasn't to correct the court. It was to remind it that even the law doesn't escape the obligation of memory. One day, her aide stepped into her office holding a stack of student essays. You've started something, he said. They're calling it, well, one of them wrote, the Crockett method isn't about law, it's about moral audit. Jasmine didn't flinch. Then they understand it better than most judges do, he smiled. One more thing, he added, handing her a handwritten envelope. This one was from a clerk. Anonymous, it read, I used to think our job was to protect the legacy of decisions. Now I think it's to protect the dignity of forgotten ones. Thank you for the reminder. She folded it slowly, placed it in the drawer beside Thomas's letter. Two voices from two different universes, neither agreeing but both acknowledging the tremor. And in the silence between them, Jasmine Crockett found the one kind of justice that cannot be passed down or written into law. Remembrance. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and looked out the window. She wasn't waiting for consensus. She was building consequence, quietly, patiently. And as the sun rose across the Capitol dome, lighting the horizon like a slow revelation, she whispered again, this time, to the past that had finally come home. Don't agree, just listen. And this time it did. But movements don't echo in applause. They rumble in institutions. And when even the Supreme Court had paused to remember, the rest of the nation had no excuse left to forget. The shift didn't begin with a press conference. It began with a memo. Stamped confidential, the Justice Department circulated a directive across its Civil Rights Division. Subject line, reevaluation of dormant precedents in educational equity, civil liberties, and voting rights. The language was clinical, restrained, but everyone who read it understood what it meant. Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with legal amnesia had forced the highest pillars of power to crack open their own archives. The memo cited Moore v. Louisiana Board of Education as a precedent with potential implications across multiple domains. Asterisk. Footnote. Then, C. Crockett, J. Congressional Record, 2025. For the first time in decades, the federal machine wasn't just looking forward, it was looking backward, with intent. Within weeks, a task force of 23 attorneys, historians, and data scientists was assembled under the DOJ's Office of Legal Policy. Their mission? Uncover cases buried by neglect, bias, or bureaucratic convenience. Not to retry, one official clarified, but to re-recognize. They called it the Equity Recovery Project, though among younger staffers the name had already stuck. Crockett's clock, a countdown, a reckoning, a restart. Old files were pulled from steel drawers. Microfilm reels buzzed awake after decades in darkness. Forgotten testimonies, dusty judgments, hand-scrawled affidavits from parents, teachers, farm workers, veterans, all exhumed and digitized. It wasn't just history, it was legal sediment, layers of justice compressed by time and political fear. And suddenly, Moore wasn't alone. They found Hernandez v. Tyler County, a 1971 case involving Mexican-American students denied access to STEM curricula in rural Texas. Overturned on administrative grounds, but built on Moore's framework. They found Lee v. Grant Parish School Board buried in the Fifth Circuit, where a black teacher was fired for citing Moore in her lawsuit, silenced for using the very doctrine that should have defended her. One by one, the dots connected. Moore wasn't a blip, it was a thread, pulled loose, revealing a fabric of suppressed justice that had been hidden in plain sight. Outside government, the tremors grew. The ACLU, Brennan Center, and NAACP Legal Defense Fund jointly issued a public call. Reopen the forgotten. Attached was a demand for immediate review of 27 historical cases where Moore could have shifted the outcome, but wasn't cited. Each footnote read like a rebuke to the system's selective memory. In Chicago, Columbia Law held an emergency colloquium titled Precedent and the Politics of Forgetting. Guest panels overflowed. Students had to sit on the stairs. The keynote speaker, a retired appellate judge, stared out over the room and said, "I cited Jefferson last year. I never even heard of Moore. That should terrify all of us." By month 3, Georgetown, Yale, NYU, Howard, Michigan, Stanford, and Berkeley announced the same headline. Crockett Doctrine to become core curriculum. Not an elective, not a seminar. Required. Course titles varied. Memory and the Law, Forgotten Foundations, Legal Ethics and Absence. But the core was the same. How institutions choose what to remember and who pays when they forget. And in each course outline, Moore was paired with Jefferson v. Department of Education. Comparison, contrast, consequence. The cases weren't just about education anymore. They were about conscience, about what it means to uphold a system that sometimes buries its own wisdom. In one Georgetown lecture, a professor paused and asked his students, if a precedent is lost, but the need it addressed still exists, is silence the law's final word or its loudest failure? A student in the back raised her hand. It's not failure, it's opportunity. That's what Crockett proved. Even conservative institutions couldn't look away. At the University of Virginia, a constitutional law symposium led to fierce internal debate. Was Crockett's intervention an attack on judicial integrity or a restoration of its credibility? One panelist, a Reagan-era judge, surprised the room when he said, "She did what we failed to do. She reminded us that our rulings don't just shape the law, they shape memory. And memory, once distorted, distorts everything that follows." Media outlets tried to spin the story into partisan frames, some branding Crockett as a rogue disruptor, others as a legal profit. But the facts refused to bend, because every headline they printed had a source document now, a case number, a page, a name, Moore, Jefferson, and the signature of a woman who refused to let them vanish. Back in her office, Jasmine sat through it all with the same silence that had followed Clarence Thomas's letter. She didn't issue speeches, didn't tour campuses. She just kept reading, kept filing. Her desk, once cluttered with policy briefs, was now flanked by binders marked more referenced litigation, pending review. Her chief of staff once asked, "Why aren't you doing more press?" Jasmine looked up, eyes calm. "Because this was never about me. It was about remembering the people who were never invited to the table in the first place." On the Hill, some colleagues mocked her behind closed doors. "Crockett thinks she's a legal scholar now." But they didn't say it in public. They couldn't. Not when 7 law schools, the DOJ, and every major civil rights group were tracing their work back to the moment Jasmine asked one dangerous question. Did we forget more because it was too inconvenient to remember? And the institutions, one by one, had no choice but to answer. 6 months after the DOJ memo, Jasmine was invited to speak at the National Archive, not as a politician, but as a legal historian. She walked onto the stage in front of a projection that displayed 2 images side by side, the front page of Jefferson and the first line of Moore, yellowed, scanned, resurrected. She said only this: "Law without memory is not justice, it's performance. And performance doesn't heal a thing." There was no ovation, just silence. Deep, respectful. A silence that held space for the names in those lost cases. For the teachers fired, for the children shuffled, for the families who filed and were forgotten, and for the law itself finally facing its own blind spots. That night, as she stepped off stage, a young professor from NYU handed her a note. Jasmine opened it. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that forgetting is not neutrality. It's a choice. And now we choose differently." She folded it gently, said nothing. Just walked out into the night as quietly as she had entered the courtroom 6 months ago, with nothing but a file, a voice, and a question. And the world had answered. By then, Jasmine Crockett had become more than a name in the news or a footnote in legal history. She was a vessel of memory. And when she stood before the students of Howard University, the nation's most storied black law school, she didn't come to inspire. She came to remind. The air in the auditorium was heavy with anticipation, not from cameras or fanfare. There were none, just 200 chairs, most filled, and a quiet hum of reverence. The banners on the wall bore names like Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. And when Jasmine Crockett walked up to the podium, she looked not like a politician, but like someone carrying weight, personal, historical, undeniable. She didn't start with applause. She started with a story. "There was a boy," she said, voice steady, microphone catching even the softness between her syllables. 10 years old. He wore a navy hoodie and sat at the edge of a wooden bench in a courtroom that looked like it had never been built for kids. The room fell still. They told him he was a disruption, that he couldn't read at grade level, that he lacked comprehension. They suspended him. No warning, no hearing, no advocate, just a rubber-stamped letter home. She paused. "And that's when I met him. He didn't ask me to get him back into school. He asked me to tell the judge what his mother had already told the principal. He could read just fine. He just couldn't read fast enough. And nobody ever stayed still long enough to listen." Cameras clicked gently from the back. Students leaned forward. She continued. "That boy didn't need me to win. He needed me to remember, to carry his name, his silence, into rooms where decisions were made without faces. And I did." Jasmine pulled a folded slip of paper from her jacket pocket. It looked old, creased and frayed. "This is his note," she said. "Please remember me when you go write laws." That's all it said. That's all he had. The weight of that sentence didn't settle. It slammed. Around the room, students glanced at each other, not in confusion, but in recognition. Every law student at Howard had encountered a version of that boy, whether through family, neighborhood, or memory. A system that measured worth by fluency, that punished delay instead of investigating cause, that sorted children like files. Jasmine let the silence stretch just long enough. Then she said, "He didn't fail the system. The system failed him and expected no one to notice." Her words didn't rise. They dropped like anchors. One hand in the third row slowly lifted. A young man, no older than 24. His blazer was too big at the shoulders, his notebook filled with scribbled lines in blue pen. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice clear, "with everything you've exposed, everything you've changed, do you believe you've won?" A question simple in structure, lethal in implication. Jasmine didn't flinch. "I wasn't called to win," she said slowly. "I was called so that the system doesn't get to forget." Another pause. "Winning is temporary. Memory is permanent. And if the law forgets who it hurt, it will hurt them again. That's not a hypothesis. That's history." She stepped out from behind the podium, letting her voice stretch across the room, not as a lecture, but as a reckoning. "Do you know what happens when the legal system forgets Moore versus Louisiana?" she asked. "It forgets that education isn't charity. It's a constitutional promise. It forgets that precedent isn't a trophy. It's a guardrail. It forgets that children aren't data points. They're citizens." Jasmine's tone sharpened. Moore wasn't erased by malice. It was erased by convenience. The court didn't strike it down. It just moved on, quietly, politely, bureaucratically. And what followed? Decades of rulings where equality was debated as if it were optional. She looked down for a second, not for drama, but to center herself. When she looked back up, her voice had turned to steel. "I have stood before judges who asked me why I cared so much about an old case. I've been told I was being emotional, uncollegial, obsessed. But if forgetting a child like that boy in court is considered professional, then I'll gladly be unprofessional." A ripple of applause broke out, but she raised her hand gently. "Not yet." She took a step forward. "We teach law like it's logic, but it's not just logic. It's memory organized into rules. If you manipulate that memory, you manipulate the rules. If you erase the stories that don't fit the narrative, you bend the system without ever touching a single statute." Now the applause returned, louder, more visceral, but Jasmine remained still. She wasn't finished. "And that's why I keep telling his story, not because it's unique, but because it's common, and that should terrify every one of us." A second hand went up, this time a woman, eyes brimming. "Do you still know where he is?" Jasmine looked down at the note once more. "He's 18 now, works nights, studies part-time. We still talk. He doesn't follow court decisions. He follows whether or not I still remember him. And I do." She folded the note and placed it back in her jacket, almost ritualistically. "I told you, I didn't come here to inspire. I came here to remind. If our law forgets the invisible, it becomes a weapon disguised as order." Someone whispered, "Amen." She smiled faintly. "You want to change the law? Start with what it forgot." One last pause. Then Jasmine looked around the room, locking eyes with future defenders, prosecutors, lawmakers, and judges. "When you sit on the other side of the bench," she said, "and someone invokes a precedent you've never heard of, don't brush it aside. Look it up. Ask why it disappeared. Ask what it meant. Ask who it saved. Because justice isn't just what we say in rulings. It's what we choose to remember between them." The students stood. Not because she told them to, but because sometimes truth stands taller than applause. As the students at Howard returned to their seats, minds shaken, hearts full, Jasmine Crockett remained still, her silhouette etched against the light like the outline of a lesson too costly to forget. What had just unfolded was more than a speech. It was a reckoning. And now what remained was the question that always lingers after truth is told. What does it mean? Jasmine turned from the podium slowly, her eyes scanning the young faces before her. Some teary, some clenched in resolve, all marked by the weight of memory now shared. "Let me be clear," she began, voice low but unmistakably firm. "The law didn't just forget that boy. It forgets thousands like him every day. But forgetting isn't passive. It's a choice." She paced slowly, each step deliberate, like she was walking a line between past and future. "We live in a system that calls itself blind. But it only wears the blindfold when it's convenient. And when injustice hides in legal footnotes, when precedent is buried beneath political tides, it's not just a legal failure, it's a moral one. She stopped, right in the center of the stage, hands clasped tightly. The real test of justice, she said, isn't how we treat the famous. It's how we treat the forgotten, the ones without headlines, without resources, without time. A silence followed, but it wasn't emptiness. It was reverence. Then Jasmine spoke one final truth, the kind that doesn't fade. You want to change this country? Don't just fight to win. Fight to remember. Because memory, painful, raw, relentless memory, is the first step to repair. She stepped back, not in retreat, but like someone who knew her part was done. And as she left the stage, the lights above her dimmed, not to end the moment, but to mark it. A lesson had been carved into time, one that no court, no politician, no selective history would be able to erase. Not anymore. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.